I hope that through the 1 hour spent with me, we'll have an opportunity to look at familiar works of art in a new kind of way. From the emails Isabel de Carries and I exchanged, it was very clear to me that her intention was to stimulate relationships with visual art, especially the visual art from Guyanese and Caribbean artists. In responding to her brief, what I propose to do this evening is to extend the dialogue Stanley Greaves and I shared monthly in the Starbuck News from April 2015 to March 2017 by exploring two basic ways of interpreting art: isolationism and contextualism, and afterwards to explore an art critical modality relative to each: formalism and Marxist art criticism. Hence, you will see many of the images from the conversation series that are in the National Collection as we explore critical approaches to visual art with reference to works in the Guyana National Collection. In starting a discussion about art, it is useful to define the term, but in today's 2018 reality, there is no easy, simple definition of the term because many things that gain status as art confound many knowledgeable and not so knowledgeable audiences. And constantly, the parameters of what constitutes art is being shifted and redefined. Perhaps there are some of you in this room for whom the two photographic images before you are not art. Firstly, they are photographs, and for some of you, you may be thinking, well, photographs aren't really art, or maybe just some types of photographs really are art and others are not. What you're seeing before you is, on the left-hand side, Untitled from the Silhouette series done in Mexico in 1973 by our artist Ana Mendieta, and to the right, Self-Portrait with Blood that she did in the same year, 1973. So, fundamental to all art, whether they are deliberately made as art or they get such classification later on, perhaps centuries and millennia later, are three things. The three basic ingredients are subject, and that refers to the work having reference to a person, an object, or a theme. It has content, meaning the total message of the work, what the work is intending to say about the subject. And it has form, which is a complicated art term which at its basic means how the art presents itself. Form in art refers to how the elements of art such as line, color, and shape are used in relation to the principles of design such as balance, harmony, rhythm, and repetition. It therefore means an object such as this, Trophies of Empire, done in between 1972 and 1974, can be seen as art because it has a subject. The title is very telling. It seems to be referencing the colonial empires. Its content can be assumed. It seems to be interrogating that structure, perhaps specifically referencing the emasculating of the black male, and it has a form, a way of presenting itself. It is sculptural, it is void of color, it uses cold, harsh materials. Within a gridded space, 29 black cylindrical or phallic forms of varying length and thicknesses are displayed. Some are chained, others are in candle holders, and others are in cups. This is part of the work's form. The artist is Donald Luck, who passed away in 2010 at age 80. He's Guyanese. The work was acquired by the Tate Britain in 2015. With subject, content, and form as our guide, it also means that this installation by me, Walk With Me, a show, which closed today incidentally, can be seen as art because it has a subject, violence against women and girls. It has content. It encourages telling of one's story, healing, and removal from situations of violence when possible. And it has form. Its materiality of unfired clay, paper, film, acrylic on canvas. As a room, it's sculptural, it's experiential. It asks that you embody a space, an atmosphere within it. It evokes particular tactile sensations, visual sensations, and auditory. And I made a point of including this because I've used typing sheets that you pass through a printer to make work. I've used cardboard. And when some people were confronted with it, they were, I don't get it. That was essentially their response. I don't get it. How is this art? Words on paper, how is this art? So that is why I included it this evening, to show you that, in fact, it does adhere to those basic ingredients. More importantly, a work is art because of the institutionalist theory of art, which assigns status of art to a gesture or object because it has been defined as such by the institutions, meaning the artists, the critics, the art schools, the museums, and the galleries. And I like to tell my students when I bring this up in one of my classes with them, you guys as audience have nothing to say in whether the thing is art. The artists and the institutions, etc., they're the ones. So when you're confounded and you say this is not art, well, your job at that point, and what I'm going to try to do this evening, is to try to figure out why the institutions categorize this thing as art. So here we have before us work by Adrienne Piper. She is an American conceptual performance artist born in 1948. She's still working. The Mythic Being was done in 1973 to 1975, and in it she films herself walking the streets of New York City and Cambridge, Massachusetts as, I quote, as a light-skinned African-American man with a mustache and an afro and wearing sunglasses. She repeated memorized phrases from her personal journals and challenged passers-by to categorize her by race, gender, and class. These actions, along with the documentation, are the art. And for most Guyanese, they're confounded by this and the point of tonight's lecture. So, when we're confounded by works of art, what do we do? The first thing, there are two basic approaches. You can either take the isolationist approach or you can take the contextualist approach. Both of these approaches we're going to explore this afternoon. You're going to realize that you're actually quite familiar with them, and you're going to realize that you actually probably sometimes, if not most times, apply it to works of art in terms of literary works of art, film, music. You may not necessarily do it with visual art because there seems to be this perception that, oh, I can look at it, I can see it, I can get it. If I don't get it, I don't get it. Move on. So let's first look at isolationism. Adherents of isolationism advocate that a work can be known on its own merit by reviewing its form and style. Failure to know a work, they advocate, the formalists advocate, should result in re-exposure to that work and re-experiencing that work until it is known. It is assumed that with knowledge will come appreciation. Therefore, no external knowledge is necessary because such knowledge interferes with enjoyment. And I would add, such knowledge can foster false appreciation or remove appreciation due to extraneous information. Stemming from isolationism is formalism, one of many art critical modalities. Formalism describes the critical position that the most important aspect of a work of art is its form, the way the work is made, and its purely visual aspects, rather than its narrative content or its relationship to the visible world. In painting, therefore, a formalist critic would focus exclusively on the qualities of color, brushwork, form, line, and composition. In essence, therefore, formalism's focus is on the art object and not the creator, the artist, or the audience. The elements of art and their relationship to the principles of design are most important, not representation, not symbolism, or as we say in art, the iconography that is used, not the values associated with religion or politics or the social environment. Strict formalists, in essence, value the notion of art for art's sake. For them, art exists for the sake of itself, to be a thing of beauty and not an instructional tool about religion, political expectations, and political hierarchies, national agendas, or any such. Activism in art has no place either. And when confronted by such art, whether it's activist art or something of a nationalistic sort, a formalist will ignore the work's religious, political, national, or activist agendas and focus instead on the work's form embodied in the elements of art and the principles of design. These elements of art are, as you see before you, color, line, shape, texture, space, and light. In doing a formal analysis, one needs to know the name of the work, who did it, when it was done, and the medium. Secondly, one needs to describe the work. Is it a landscape or a portrait? Is it done representationally or semi-abstractly? Is it Baroque or abstract expressionistic in style? Right away, I think you guys are realizing that the formalists are asking you to do some homework, to come to the work having done some work. Then you follow with an exploration of the elements and the principles. Relative to the element of color, you would want to say whether the composition is predominated by primary colors, secondary or tertiary colors, whether the color palette is warm or cool, and to which color scheme the work adheres to. Whether it's monochromatic. Now, I have a very basic color wheel before us here, and they get very complex, okay? Sorry about that. Within the monochromatic color scheme, we take one color on the color wheel, what we call a hue, H-U-E, hue, and you adjust that color adding black and white to it, and you make your composition based on that only. With the analogous color scheme, you're taking colors that are alongside each other on the color wheel. With the complementary, you're taking colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. And with the polychromatic, you're taking any color from on any group of colors from on the color wheel. So you would want to know, be able to identify whether or not the work is monochromatic or largely monochromatic, if it's analogous, etc. You would also want to be able to say whether or not local color has been used or whether or not the color has been used in an anti-naturalistic or a decorative way. So what do we mean by that when we say local color? If you've painted a banana, have you painted an apple banana with yellow skin and little brown flecks and a little black tip, or have you painted it purple or orange? If you've painted it yellow with browns and blacks, you've used local color. If you've used purple and blue, you've used anti-naturalistic color, you've used color in a decorative manner. Relative to line, what types of lines are used in a composition? They want you to look at it in terms of, as simple as that, are there straight lines, are there curved lines, are there zigzag lines, curvilinear lines? What is the relationship of the lines to each other? Is one seeming to be aggressive towards the other? A thin line next to a thick line? A thin line that is falling on a thick line has certain suggestions. So they want you to look at it in terms of as simple as what are the lines doing? What types of lines are there? And are they present? Are the lines actually present within the composition? Are there implied lines within this composition? What do we mean by implied? Someone pointing, if you have a composition, a picture with a child, let's say they're pointing at the sky. From the tip of their finger moving up into the sky is an implied line. Your eye follows that line, so that's an implied line. Likewise with gaze, you may have a picture of a mother and child. She's embracing that child. She looks down at that child. There's a line that is created. So they want you to talk about those things as well. Do the lines create movement or do they create emphasis? So there are a number of things that they're asking you to look at the work in terms of color and line. And the third one we'll look at is space. Relative to space, can we speak of the space of the canvas or the picture plane being handled decoratively or illusionistically? Now, picture plane, when we say picture plane, we're talking about the surface upon which the picture is made. So in Dominique Hunter's Tug of War Kind of Love, the space that encompasses the surface upon which she has done her drawing, we can talk about her having handled things decoratively. We can talk about there being an absence of illusion of depth, giving one a sense that one could walk into the picture. We can talk about the picture being done in mostly grayscale, meaning variations of gray. There is a meaningful absence of color in this picture. We can talk about her having used organic lines when you look at the figure. There are natural lines there. We can talk about geometric lines which occupy the negative space. The negative space of a picture is that area of the picture that is not occupied by the subject of the picture, what we would call the background. And in this instance, she seems to have treated the negative space with parity with the positive space, the area occupied by the subject. As it relates to illusionistic space, we can also speak about the rules of perspective. We can look at that work and see how the artist has manipulated the rules of perspective and how convincingly he or she has managed to create this illusion of depth on this flat surface. I think it's an absolutely fantastic thing when you can look at a flat surface and get this sense that you can drive for miles and miles or walk for miles and miles on this surface, and there are rules that the artist has to follow. In Ron Savory's Forest Path, Night Path, he employs one-point perspective. When you stand at the head of Regent Street on a holiday or a weekend, when there's a near absence of cars on Regent Street, which is very infrequent, you will notice that the road appears to taper, it appears to meet at a point way off in the distance. This is the effect of one-point perspective, and this is what Ron Savory has done in Forest Path, Night Path. You get a sense that you are standing on a forest path, and you can walk into this picture, and you'll hear the birds Isabel spoke about earlier chirping. You might even hear something slithering in the bush, moving about in the bush. You get a sense of a realistic space looking at it. When we look at how the lines are used, you notice the lines that are used to delineate the tree trunks, those that are closest to us are thick, and as they go away, they become just a slight line in the distance. They become slenderer as they move away. And this is also an aspect of one-point perspective, something that is employed by Merlin Ellis in her image, A Slice of Itiri, BC. She also, as things go off in the distance, they get smaller, they become slightly discernible, but she also employs what is called atmospheric perspective. As things go further away from you, things tend to get a haze of blue on them. And the artist captures that and is able to give us a convincing appearance of depth within that space. If the artist is not very successful in capturing atmospheric perspective, you may not get that sense that, yeah, I can jump in a canoe and travel on this water and go to the banks way across the river. So just in looking at space, color, and line, you can have a very rich dialogue with a work of art. So it becomes more than just, oh, you look at it and, oh, it's nice, that's very nice, I like it, and you move on. You can have a very enriched experience with it. Looking at the principles of design, we've got balance, emphasis, scale and proportion, repetition and rhythm, unity and variety, and contrast. Now, as it relates to those elements of art, these are things that are always there in a work. Likewise, with the principles of design, these are always present in a work. Some may be more emphasized, might be more present than others, but they're always present, and any art student, any artist has to be conscious of these things. It gets to a point where you're not thinking, okay, do I have balance in the work? Do I have emphasis? It becomes second nature to you. So we have these 6 principles of design, and we're just going to look at balance and emphasis briefly. Whether the work is a painting or an installation, the artist must work with balance in mind, either to possess balance or to deliberately omit it for a communicative purpose. Cyril Kanai's Green Land of Guyana is a lovely imaging of Guyana in the present and aspirationally. The composition evidences an asymmetrical balance. Should one draw a central line, a vertical axis, the 2 halves do not replicate, but the composition visually does not feel heavier on either side. Kanai has used rectangular forms alongside tree trunk-like forms in a vertical format within a vertical canvas. That, along with the use of a predominantly monochromatic one-color scheme, creates harmony within the composition. The potential monotony and boredom is averted by sudden appearances of white. You have the white here for the waterfall, a bit of white here as well in other areas, a sudden appearance of red, and we have yellow ochre, which occupies a great portion of the sky. Emphasis can be achieved in a number of ways. In this instance, Stephanie Correia has occupied the literal center of a picture plane, but it is not immediately evident or unsettling. In Art Basics 101, we are told not to arrange the composition around the center point, or rather, the center line. Correia has done precisely this, however. She inhabits the space, and she does so with movement in an otherwise static composition. I actually did measure this composition, and it fell directly on the center line. Because she occupies the center line with movement, you see the figures are moving, they're walking, dancing. Our eyes come into this point as well, and we moved to the head, which is another dominant point within the composition for its sheer size and its sheer difference from everything else. So the focal point within the composition is quite a large area of the composition, and you can see that elsewhere in the composition things are rather static. There are some houses, there's a tree that doesn't seem to really blow with the wind. It doesn't seem like there's much wind. The smoke from the fire is just going straight up. But here we have this sudden appearance of movement right at the center line. It works in this instance that she's occupied the literal center of the canvas. A work can, however, be afocal, meaning there's an absence of a focal point. I don't have an example for you, however. Dudley Charles's River Spirit is a fantastic example of a study in color, line, shape, texture, space, and light. Here we have a polychromatic composition, and the color again is off a bit, dominated by tints of blue. What do we mean by a tint of blue? Blue mixed with white. A shade of a color would be that color mixed with black. And in this instance, in this polychromatic composition that is dominated by tints of blue, the composition is punctuated by sudden small appearances of red, yellow ochre, and greens. Charles has introduced the non-colors of black, which creates a point of emphasis here in this area of the composition, and white, which is in this area of the composition. Why I say non-color, on the color wheel you did not see black and white. In art we say black is not a color and white is not a color, everything else is a color. So we have our own special little rules where that's concerned. He moves our eye across the composition in a world of mystery. We stand by the river's edge of an expansive river embodied by this mystery and witness a distant unknown land. Here, along the horizon line, we see land way off in the distance. And you'll notice that he's employed atmospheric perspective here. Yeah, you can see it there. He's employed atmospheric perspective. He's allowed it to be tinged in blue. In this case, he's got a bit of purple involved in that blue mix. We stand, and we're not before the painting, and we're not certain whether or not we are in the water. Perhaps we are in fact the river spirit. There is joy, there is mystery, and there is terror in the painting evoked by the shapes, the colors, the lines. The space of the composition is simultaneously shallow and expansive or deep, and the light seems to be neither day nor night. The composition is balanced by the subtle horizon line. Had that line not been there, the composition would actually feel a little weighted on the left-hand side here. But because of that line that draws us across here, and because of all this profusion of activity here, it balances things off, and so we don't feel that as much. Shapes and colors repeat themselves, creating a rhythm of movement, and that repetition creates unity. Repeated lines, shapes, and colors are punctuated with contrasting lines, shapes, and colors. We inhabit a strange place and are uncertain of ourselves in it. One may wonder, as I indicated to you, what are these figures? Are these the figures of our mythology? Are these the figures of some other creation of my mind? Dudley speaks about storytelling a lot, and how growing up he heard people telling stories quite a lot. And so looking at the image, I start to wonder if these are some of the mythical figures that he conjured up in his mind when he was listening to those stories that he's captured here in River Spirit. Quoting Stanley from our conversations, he says, "For viewers not interested in the theme, the work could perhaps even be viewed as an abstract composition to some extent where lines, textures, and colors entertain the eye. River Spirit is a fine example of work by an artist who is in full command of painting techniques used to advantage in exploring his theme," and I would add in compositional arrangements as well. So with formalism, we've also got contextualism. So you can have an opportunity to have an engaged experience with a work of art by just assessing how the elements of art are used, how the principles of design are used. However, the contextualists say to us that no, you can't actually really appreciate that work and really know that work unless you look at the context of that work. A work can only be known fully and appreciated if we know about the artist, his or her personal background, his or her training in art or other professional background, his or her sociocultural and sociopolitical times. Much the same kinds of things you do with literature, you do with the visual arts as well. For many Guyanese, the 1763 monument confounds, especially the figure atop of Kofi. It challenges many aesthetically. As a child, and I'll give you a little bit of a personal experience with this work, with this work. As a child, I was very afraid of traveling eastbound on Brick Dam because of this figure. I found the figure atop unnatural in appearance, angry, and continually spouting water in rage. My mom doesn't actually know it. She worked at the Ministry of Health, and I was so terrified to go to her workplace because, oh my God, Kofi's there, and he's angry, and he's spouting water all the time. He was an absolutely frightful figure to me, and I tried to avoid seeing him, thinking that if I didn't see him, he didn't really exist. But we know the truth. He was always there. And when we would pass him to go through the cemetery road, I felt such relief to get past it. For a long period of time, I wasn't able to experience the work. And when I was reintroduced to the work, after several years. It was a curious figure to me, interesting, but figured I could do without it. The figure atop the plane still looked alien, yet it was obviously meant to represent a human. The figure lacked anatomical accuracy. For instance, the head to body ratio was obviously unnatural. The definition of muscles was absent, and the figure seemed to lack a skeletal foundation. For instance, I heard on the bus one time when we first got back, somebody looked up at Coffee, and it was like, why did man make the head so big? Nobody head is so big, you know. Why did man make the head so big? And this is the point of the contextualists. As a student at UG, I had to write about the 1763 monument. I had spent 2 years at Burroughs as a full-time student, 1 year as a part-time. And so by the time I came to do my paper at UG, I had already met and spoken with Uncle Philip. He became Uncle Philip to me at length. I knew where he was born, I knew where he was raised, of his social background. I had watched him paint, applying dots of paint to the surface, whether it was canvas or one of those brown barrels. I had watched him on numerous occasions applying paint to the canvas from the tube, directly from the tube, in this sort of meditative manner, as though he was guided by some unseen figure. I had learned of God manliness, that we are made in his image and likeness, and therefore we have God within us. This was Philip's philosophy, and of the concept of man as an ancient soul in a modern body, another of Uncle Philip's philosophies. I understood Uncle Philip was not formally trained in art and was not trained in the Western tradition. I understood that he had received inspiration in a dream to start carving and was guided by an inner compulsion and a spirituality unfamiliar to me. I also came to learn of its visual affinity with the sacred art of West Africa. For me, within Coffee, after all of this experience with Uncle Philip, the work had hidden truths contained within it that needed unlocking. And through these interactions with Uncle Philip and my further readings, I was beginning to appreciate that work, and increasingly so with the passage of time. But the kinds of information gathering advocated by the contextualists may distract and compromise appreciation. Does it help to know that the painter of The Calling of St. Matthew, Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio, was notorious in the age of brawls for brawling? I mean, you imagine we're living in a time when people just fight, and he is got a bad rep as one of these fighters. And he even killed a man, although it's debated whether or not he did it deliberately or it was accidental. So does that make us like the work less, realizing that, you know, he's doing this religious work and he's actually a sinner according to what the religion teaches because he's killed a man? What of Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night with the vibrant hues and the glowing, pulsating nighttime objects in a daytime sky? Is our appreciation heightened knowing that he suffered a tragic illness that he did? Or are we skittish about that work? What is our relationship with that work for knowing this lot of information? An equivalent in music might be R. Kelly. For those people who know about R. Kelly and the young girl, do you like his music any less? So the contextualists are saying knowing information about your artist might actually not be good for you appreciating that work. Secondly, the contextualists also say we should seek to have knowledge of other art by the artist, especially those of the same style or genre. And in so doing, we should look for consistent themes or extraordinary themes. The artist's perspective regarding these particular themes as well. Contextualists advocate we should seek knowledge of the artist on a profound level, which can endear us to that artist and cause us to respond favorably to their work. So they're asking also, along with the formalists, that you do some work in order to appreciate that work of art. Thirdly, conceptualists advocate we gain knowledge of the conceptual and theoretical basis of the genre in use if applicable. Is the work surrealist? Is it impressionist? So when you look at Stanley Greaves' work, and I've heard people say, it looks nice, but I don't really get it, they're saying you might be able to appreciate that work if you understand its relationship to surrealism. you might be able to have a meaningful relationship with that work starting from that point. Fourthly, contextualists advocate we gain knowledge of the artist's times. Specifically, we want to consider the social, economic, and political climate of the work. How is the artist responding to these particulars? Is he or she critiquing or willfully withdrawing a reflection of the circumstances or a critique? What are the art relevant ideas permeating at the time, and does this have bearing on the work's subject, content, or form? We should also gain knowledge of the complexity of the medium, the contextualists tell us. As it relates to painting, we need to know that acrylics dry very fast, and thus an artist needs to work very fast in order to get the same kinds of effects that a person working with oil paints is able to get. Even when we use retarders, we are not able to manipulate the paint for as long as the artist working with oil paints is able to manipulate that paint. We also need to recognize the difference between, for instance, a wash and an impasto. As it relates to the work done in clay, whether it's pottery or sculpture, we need to know that while clay is a flexible material, it is a technical, very technical material to work with. At the entire process of working with clay, one has to be very careful. In the stages of preparation, you have to make sure you prepare that clay well, you clean it well, you prepare the clay so that when it goes into the kiln, whatever you make out of it, you don't have little air bubbles in it, so things can blow up in the kiln. So when Stephanie Correia is able to do that fantastic work with clay, you need to understand the process, the contextualist tells us, the process that she would have gone through to arrive at the result that she got. And when we look at sculpture, for instance, when we look at Fighting for Global Peace by Winslow Craig, we need to recognize how challenging working with this medium is. You cannot make a mistake with this medium. If you make a mistake with the wood, you can't erase it like a drawing. You can't paint over it with white as with a painting. You got to start over. Otherwise, you sacrifice the integrity of the work. This is one piece of wood that he's done this work with. This is not several pieces of wood that he's done this with. So one needs to recognize the challenges involved in working with a medium such as wood, carving from wood. And you need to also appreciate the different types of wood. Not only are they hard to come by, to acquire, but they're actually very hard to work with. Salmon is easier, relatively easier than, for instance, green heart or mahogany. So what an artist might be able to get with one type of wood, they may not be able to get with that other type. And the contextualists are telling us to take on board all of this as well. They ask us finally, they advocate that we gain knowledge of the artist's intentions. However, is the artist's intention all the work may say? What of the viewer's response? Is this not valid? How does the viewer's understanding relate when it differs or does not support the artist's intention? Before us, we have works from The Gentleman in the Garden series by Bernadette Persaud. In 1980, Persaud was amongst those who lost their job for, as she says, for creating instability by joining protests in the wake of the assassination of Walter Rodney. With lots of time on her hands, she painted, and by her first exhibition in 1984, the seeds of a few series were germinating. The Gentleman in the Garden series was amongst them. She had been painting the birds and lilies, and there in the Garden City, in the botanical gardens, she was struck by the presence of the men wearing camouflage and combat boots carrying rifles. All this idyllic beauty tinged with fear-inducing presence, and the normalizing of these contrasts are evident within the series. No one said anything about it, so as she said, she decided she would through paint. Lotus of July is a late series painting also by Persaud from the Lotus of Time series, which she started in the early 1980s, in about 1981. In that series are Lotus of Pain, Lotus of 1,000 Desires, and Lotus of 100 Petals. She was drawn to the lotus as she contemplated the fading beauty of the lotus flowers growing freely in front of her home. As she worked on this and the other concurrent series, she experienced the loss of her father and her brother, and as she says, and I quote her, "Lots of people were dying around me." With these losses, she saw in the lotus impermanence and transience, and these conflicted with how others spoke of the lily as the sacred lotus, the lotus of timelessness. In the lilies, Persaud saw a cycle of life. The lotus bloomed, faded, and decayed, and was replaced by another. Gradually, she saw in that cycle the sacred lotus others spoke of, and with that emerged the birth of the lotus and the series. Within that series, she had a sub-series, the lotus of my great-grandmother, which explored such concepts as, and I quote her, Kuli color, Maya, Samsara, and other Hindu philosophical concepts. In the Birth of Lotus series, Persaud says she was exploring her cultural retentions as an East Indian with Hindu ancestry and as one coming out of a Christianized home. The lotus, therefore, within the few images I've shared this evening are not merely pretty images, pretty flowers captured by a skilled painter, bathed in glorious morning light or an overcast or late afternoon light. They represent a process of thinking, of healing, of cultural reclamation, and of responding to individual need to speak when quieted. In a 2004 interview with Caribbean Beat, Persaud talked about what motivated her and said, "In all of my work, whether I'm dealing with the ancestral cultural aspect of it or whether I'm dealing with the man with the gun, I'm trying to show everyone that here is beauty, which, though it may be close to you, you don't see. You don't notice because of your own conditioned blindness and ignorance, your own cultural limitations. This is what motivates me. This is what I try to take on in my art." Contextual art critical approaches include feminist art criticism, Freudian art criticism, iconography, meaning the reading of symbols within a work, and Marxist art criticism. Each requires an assessment of work that surpasses its form and its style. Each requires substantial context, but will only look briefly at the latter. Marxist art historians and critics read works of art mainly in relation to their political and economic role in society. For the Marxist art critic, art reflects the internal conflicts of society. The art practitioner, the painter, the sculptor, is a worker like any other who is alienated from their production as this worker must produce to satisfy the desires of others, usually an economic, political, and/or religious elite. This, the Marxist art critic says, has always been the case ever since the gradual emergence of social stratification in the New Stone Age of the ancient Egyptian pyramids in Africa and Stonehenge in Europe. Art, however, is relevant, they say. It reflects the period of its making, but as it does so, it is a consumer good, and so it often loses its ability to critique the society and propose alternatives. Human World by Dennis Williams, in exercising its relevance, captures some of the social reality of the West Indian immigrants' experience in London in the mid to late 1940s. Williams captures their variety and the optimism and the isolation and the pathos of the West Indian immigrant. Far away from home, they were strangers amongst each other and strangers in a land substantially different from home and increasingly unwelcoming. In the stern, unsmiling expressions, one can see reflections of signs of unwelcome. Rooms to let, no dogs, no colors. They're secure of jobs for which they were overqualified for or for which they earned less than their white counterparts. In the staring eyes, one can see the hurt of being welcomed by the British ruling party, but unwelcomed by the people amongst whom they must live. One can also see nerve and grit and determination. One can see the factories looming in the background, workplace for many. A Marxist art critical reading is simply a way of reading into the image. According to Laurie Schneider Adams, in her Methodologies of Art, Marx opposed the 19th century art for art's sake, as I've already indicated, because formalism, they felt, fails to account for moral, social, and economic factors in the making and selling of art. In fact, Ernst Fischer, writer of the famous The Necessity of Art, advocates that, and I quote, "In a decaying society, art, if it is truthful, must also reflect decay. And unless it wants to break faith with its social function, art must show the world as changeable and help to change it." Fischer, the communist, did not believe art should serve the state, but serve its ideological foundation critically. He was actually a minister of something or the other in government. In other words, no state propaganda. In closing, I wish to reflect on this relevant image by Dudley Charles, a Nancy story painted in 1980. I've never actually seen it in person. In fact, it was only just a few days ago that I saw it as an electronic image. I am told others of the series are in the National Collection. However, I don't recall seeing any at a Castellani exhibition in the last 22 years. Granted, I've missed a few. The Chronicle's Rashid Osman writes on September 28, 1980, 3 days after Charles's second solo exhibition opened at the Umanayana, where this work was shown for the first. He writes, "Charles captures much bravado on his Anansi canvases. The mythical character stalks through his verdant and overwhelming environment with a machismo that would put some Hollywood heroes to shame. The implications seem clear to anyone with knowledge of Guyana in 1980. On the origin of the painting. Sometime in the first half of 1980, there was a political meeting at Merriman Mall. Walter Rodney was scheduled to speak. Dudley Charles was there, but he stood on Church Street to watch the proceedings. He says he knew something was going to happen, and to quote him, in those days, something was always happening. So he had taken the viewing point that he had taken. Rodney was scheduled to speak, but was not allowed to speak with any instruments, so he stood on a tapir with something like a bullhorn, Charles recalls. Police came with gas masks and tear gassed the gathering. In Anansi's story, we see Rodney to the front, and you see Guyana to his left. We can discern the police with their batons and gas masks to the left, and the tear-gassed audience to the right of the composition in retreat and in horrific agony. Was Charles intending to make a political painting? To say something deliberate about the Burnham government, as some thought he was? No, he says, but he was trying to speak about the now and not yesterday, not a cultural past or a sanitized present with cokers and palm trees like many others were doing at the time. In his estimation, and I quote him, art is the only true statement and vision of a nation. So he needed to tell the stories of today for tomorrow. This is what he was doing with the Old House series, and here again with the Anansi series. Charles set out to be a recorder of his present, and in so doing became relevant in the Marxist sense in speaking about an event that characterized the continued implementation of a political ideology. Persaud, on the other hand, was not only relevant in recording the psychic tensions of the socio-political environment as she assessed them, but admits to doing so deliberately. I wish to extend thank yous to Bernadette Persaud and to Dudley Charles for providing me with images and for talking with me about their work. I also wish to thank Ohini Kawama, curator of the National Gallery of Art, Castellani House, curator acting rather, for the permission to reuse these images this evening and for provision of the Anansi story image.